So weren't those great readings this morning? You're pitiful, blind, threadbare, homeless. You make me vomit. Catches your attention. We've been talking the last few weeks about bad religion versus good religion. I've said a couple of times I prefer to use the language of maybe healthy religion rather than unhealthy religion. We know where unhealthy religion takes us. We have situations where people act in the name of religion and detonate bombs, open fire on people. I'd say that's kind of toxic religion. We're trying to look at healthy religion, good religion. And unfortunately, our mainline Protestant church in particular seems to be getting a really bad reputation. If anything, I've heard it as a United Church minister, particularly from some of my more evangelical and conservative family, that, well, that United Church of yours, that's kind of like wishy-washy. We're not necessarily hot or cold. We get blamed for being wishy-washy. I call it tolerant. But anyway, it's all in how someone else perceives something. But I realize that as a particular denomination of our Christian faith, the United Church, we tend to sometimes get that kind of criticism. And even my son, I was talking with him the other day, and he was saying, Mom, I think I understand what you're talking about, that people need to kind of get a better sense of the perception of church. You don't have a really good perception out there. Everybody thinks that churches are very rigid and self-righteous and all the things that Reverend John and I have been talking about over the last few weeks. He says, and those other religions or their faiths, they've got a real clear statement. It's like, you come or you go to hell. I'm saying, okay, well, that's not quite where I'm at, but I see your point. We have to have a clear message. So, and the message we want to portray is not necessarily a wishy-washy one. But I think there's so much about our faith that is so positive, and I think sometimes the issue is more just how do we get that message out? How are we able to share that message? And so this week in the book that Reverend John and I have been following in this series, the author Thalen says, you have to be more passionate rather than passive about your faith. And he has some suggestions of how that might work. And he asks a couple of questions to start with. He says, now what difference does my faith make in my life? If you didn't come here on a Sunday morning, or if you didn't participate in this community of faith, what kind of a difference would it make for you? And if our faith doesn't seem to really matter to us or make a difference in our lives beyond our Sunday morning plans, why should anyone else want to join us? It's just kind of another thing to book in our busy, already overly taxed schedule. So Martin Thayson raises these questions, and he suggests that we need to live our faith with integrity, with passion, and boldly. I thought, okay, that makes sense to me. So first of all, let's look at living our faith with integrity, because sometimes that's the biggest criticism we'll get. People say, oh, you're so hypocritical. You say one thing, but then I see how you act. And there's this great story in his book. He talks about driving along, and this person was in this car, and the light was turning yellow, so he slowed the car down and stopped, and the person in the car behind him was honking the horn and giving him the finger and yelling out the window and just totally blowing a gasket. And he was thinking, my gosh, I had to stop. I wasn't going to go through. So anyway, the person that was doing all the honking and the whatever, having the little hissy fit, there was a tap at her window. It was a police officer. She rolls down her window. He says, would you step out of the car, please? Next thing you know, she finds herself in the police station. And she's sitting in a cell waiting to figure out what's going on. Policeman comes back, takes her out to an office. They sit down with her with the arresting officer. And she says, I don't understand what I did. And the arresting officer says, well, ma'am. He says, I saw your car there. He says, I heard the honking. I saw you yelling and screaming at the person ahead of you. I saw how much in a hurry you were to get through that light. He says, and then I saw the bumper stickers. What would Jesus do? Follow me to Sunday school? And the fish sign? And he says, I thought you were driving a stolen car. We're called to live our lives with integrity. We can't be honking the horn and throwing the finger with "what would Jesus do" stickers on our bumper. There has to be a connection with what we believe and how we live our life. So we have to live our lives with integrity and express our faith in that way, because you never know who's watching. And I recall being in high school, and I remember high school for me, we had moved from a home that I'd been in since kindergarten all the way up through grade 8, and then we moved to Mississauga out of Toronto, and I started high school for the first time, and it was a school of 2,000 students, and I knew absolutely no one. And for an introvert, I mean, that was a challenge in and of itself, but also I had been very comfortable in my school life. I mean, I was used to people recognizing me, and in a class, if they asked somebody to do something, "Oh, we know that Galen can do that, we'll ask her to do that." Like, you're known. It's your community, it's your family. So it was a real hard transition. So I don't remember a lot about the first couple of years. It was just kind of felt a little bit like a struggle trying to fit in and everything. And then I think it was about grade 11, I was away on a retreat, a youth retreat that our church had put on in partnership with another Anglican church in the city I was in. And so we were sitting in groups and we were just talking, and this young woman came up to me and she said, she said, "It's so neat to meet you." And I said, "Oh, thanks." She says, "We go to the same high school." And I'm like, "Oh, really?" Because, 2,000 students. Chances are you wouldn't meet everybody. And so she said, "Yeah." She says, "I've always admired you. I've seen you walking in the hallways. I've seen the things that you've been involved in. I just thought that's a person I'd like to meet, and I'm so glad I have the chance to meet you today." I was oblivious. I had no idea that my actions were having an impact on somebody else or their impression of me. So how we live our lives, the things that we do and say, they mean so much because they speak so much. And it was St. Francis of Assisi who said, go live your faith, and if necessary, use words. It's how we act and what we do in our lives that make the most impression. So our scripture today was talking about being the salt and being the light. We can add so much to our world in the things that we do each and every day. And people notice. And so when they ask you why you're doing what you're doing, then perhaps you might share with them why you feel motivated to do or act the way that you do. So that's the first point, is living our lives, our faith lives, with integrity. And then Martin talks about a second point, which I think is equally important. He says, you have to live your faith with passion. I saw some time ago a little something on YouTube, and it was something that was put out by a church. I think it was in Toronto, and it was kind of one of these, I call it a pop-up church. They kind of go into a location that they've never been to before, and they invite everybody in, and it's all through Instagram and Facebook and what have you. And all these young people were gathered, and they were doing baptism, which was kind of surprising for a relatively new community, but they were doing this rite of initiation. And the people that had been baptized that day, they had these t-shirts, black t-shirts with white lettering on them, said, #I'm in. I thought, okay, so that's the new baptism logo. #I'm in. I guess it was by immersion. So I just thought, well, isn't that fascinating? I thought, we do certain rituals or things, but we're not necessarily as public about them as what some people are. But obviously that person felt passionate about the commitment they had made to the church, and they were willing to put #I'm in on their shirt and wear it in public. I thought, would I? It would actually bring up some interesting questions. What does that mean? Oh, well, let me tell you. See, our evangelical friends, we may differ on theology sometimes, but they know how to share the message. They know how to share their faith, and we could learn from that we could be a little less shy, a little less introverted about sharing our faith. Not pushy. I'm not saying go knocking on doors, because we all hate that. But if the subject were to come up, are we willing to be a little more open about sharing why it makes such a difference? Why we're willing to spend 5 hours in church and roast how many pounds of pork and mix it all in and cut up all that coleslaw, and why? Why do we do these things? It's important for people to know, because it might make a difference in their life, and there might be something that they're really searching for or needing that we need to share with them. So to live our lives of faith with passion. Now, I also recall as I said, this whole idea of being evangelical, it's turned into this kind of bad word for us. But it doesn't have to be that way. So, as I said, living our life of faith with integrity, it's the same with evangelism. Like, you can just express to people by your lifestyle how you're living your faith. There's what they call relational evangelism. If you're happening to have a friend or a person at work who you know that's struggling, you might say, "Can I take you out for a coffee?" You don't have to be pushy. And they might start sharing their story. And you could maybe say something like, "Well, you know what really helps me? I belong to this prayer group. Would you like me to put your name on the prayer list?" It's not intrusive. It's not putting a lot on them. It's just you're inviting someone in to share something that's meaningful for you and that you think might be, as a friend, helpful to them. So that's a relational evangelism. You build up relationships and connections with people, and sometimes that can make all the difference. Again, you don't know what kind of an impact you're going to have on that person's life. Just by making that phone call, just by inviting them out for lunch, just by sharing that time of coffee or tea with them. Or even say, "Hey, you know what? We've got this special service coming up toward Christmas. We have our Blue Christmas service. If you know someone that's grieving, say, mark this on your calendar. We have this really special service for people who are hurting like you. And I know it's helped a lot of people. Perhaps you'd like to come and join us. And I'll come and pick you up so you don't have to go alone." That's relational evangelism. That's just extending that invitation. There's a great story about a person who was a young person on a campus, and I've heard these kinds of stories before, and I sometimes wonder, have they made them up, or is it just, this happens, and this is repeatedly a story that people like to share. But there's a young gentleman who was in a university and involved in campus life, and a young fellow that was trying to find his way in his faith, but he was pretty bold, pretty happy about being connected with his faith community. But he thought, I'd like to connect with the church. I know I'm going to this youth group and stuff on campus, but I'd like to connect with the church. So he checks it out and he finds this local congregation he goes to. Well, the guy, he's off university campus. This story must have come from California, because he was barefoot, raggedy jeans, long hair, t-shirt, tie-dyed. You get the picture. I'm sure there was a piercing or two and probably a tattoo. So he comes into the church. My gosh, nowhere to sit. So he comes along and he's looking around, can't find somewhere to sit. So he says, he's a cool dude. I'll just sit right here. Sits right down in the center of the aisle, close to the front. Of course, you can imagine everyone's kind of like, "Oh no, what do we do? What do we do? Who's going to do? Where's the ushers? We got to do something about this." So one of the elders of the church gets up from his pew, grabs his cane, walks down the aisle in his nicely pressed three-piece suit, bow tie, kerchief, slicked back hair, goes up to the gentleman who's just waiting. "Oh no, I know he's going to have to do this. What else can you do? You know what he's going to do. He has to do it. I feel bad, but he's got to do something about this guy." Gentleman walks up, puts his cane, leans it against the pew, very gingerly gets down on his knees, crouches down, sits beside the gentleman, puts his hand out, shakes hands. "Welcome. Nice to have you with us this morning." Sat through the whole service with him. That's invitational evangelism. That's letting people know that they're welcome. That's a simple gesture, but it means so much to a person that might feel uncomfortable or unwelcome or uncertain about coming into a place like a church. Believe it or not, we're an intimidating group of people. We sit in these straight rows, we recite stuff back and forth like it's weird. People don't do this anymore. So we have to find ways to make people feel welcome. 90% of people who come to a church come because they have been invited. 90%. We can't assume people are just going to arrive anymore. You have to extend the invitation and invite people to come and make sure you're here to show them the ropes. Bring them in, explain to them what an order of service is, where the hymnals are, what a hymnal is. People who haven't been to church don't know these things, and it can be very intimidating. I know even for myself, being a churchy person, going to a different church who has different habits and a different church culture, it feels different. You feel awkward. They don't do it the way we do it back home. So imagine if you've never been to a church, how that might feel. So we have to make sure that we're making one another feel welcome. His final piece is about living our faith boldly. As you know, a little while ago, Reverend John and I preached a series on Jim Wallace. He's the writer of God's Politics, and Reverend David Chesney has been leading a group to study that book. And I read an interview of his that was brought forth by Marty Tyndall, our former moderator. And she was talking to Jim Wallace about the current situation in the States and what it means for him as a person of faith to be living in that context. And I'm trying to be politically correct, so I'm not going to go into that part of the conversation. But he did have a comment to say about the Canadian context. He says there are two things that Canadians, I think, are really wrestling with and that they have a strong desire for. He says number one is justice. There's a great desire and thirst for justice. And number two, he said there's a great desire and thirst for spirituality. He said either of those things on their own can be very dangerous, but together, spirituality and justice can be extremely powerful. He says, I see this as a time for people of faith, not to try to reform things or change things. I see this as a time of resistance, of being bold in our faith, of speaking up and defending those that need defending in the name of our faith. He said, it's a time for each of us to stand up and act boldly with our faith. And that's how we're going to make a difference in the world. It's exactly what the writer of the Gospel of Matthew was trying to say. We need to be the light and the salt in our world today because it desperately needs our faith, our boldness, our integrity, and most of all, it needs our belief that we can see a bigger and better world than the one we're living right now. We can see ways of being just and loving and kind and healing toward one another. And there's no time like the present that we need to be living that out in everything that we do in our lives today as a people of faith. I'll just close you with a great quote that Jim Wallace shared. I thought it was kind of interesting that how this quote sort of spoke to me in terms of what Guelph United Ministries is all about. If you don't know the logo or the mission statement, so to speak, for Guelph United Ministries, it's living our faith together in faith, living together, working together in faith and action. Working together in faith and action. Jim Wallace says that it's scary times right now, but God has the last word. And people of God have to live as if we believe that God has the last word. So we're just going to keep that thought as we move forward as a people of faith. We're just seeing that someone just needs a little attention here, so we'll just take a moment, and I'm going to finish up with a sermon. So remember, as a people of faith, to remember what it is that we need to focus on as our lives of faith, ones of integrity, and ones of relationship with one another, and how we live our faith makes a difference in the world.